They say true love is worth waiting for.
She felt like he was somebody good for her and her son.
But sometimes, when you think you found true love, what's actually true becomes hard to distinguish.
He had a past record. He had been incarcerated before.
It didn't seem like she knew what she was getting into with this relationship.
I think they were shooting towards the house. They were screaming and yelling.
When the unthinkable happens, how far will you go to protect your man?
Oh my God, this boy's dead.
She was pretty adamant that she wasn't involved, and neither was her boyfriend.
I'm sorry. I don't see it. Ain't nothing that you can tell me that make me believe that he killed somebody.
Friday, July 29th, 2011. It's a hot summer night in Victoria, Texas.
We call ourselves the Crossroads. We're in between major cities, so we're kind of equidistant from Austin, Houston, San Antonio, Corpus Christi.
As locals settle in for the night, Victoria Police Dispatch receives multiple concerned calls about a disturbance on Ash and Pine Streets.
Victoria 911.
Okay, I just called in. There's a big party over here in my neighborhood. Now there's some kids fighting in this park.
In the park?
Yes. The cops haven't gotten here yet. It's getting crazy.
Patrol quickly heads to the neighborhood.
They make their way to an area where people are yelling and learn the fight started at a house party and ended up in the middle of the street.
Officers learn which house on Ash Street was hosting the party and that it's rented by two brothers.
They went to the house where the party was being held. The individuals that were renting the house, Robert Gomez, Michael Gomez, did cooperate, and they did admit to the officers that they were having a party at the house.
Michael tells officers that he throws parties a lot and announces them on social media.
He would buy kegs of beer, and he would buy red Solo cups, and he would sell each cup for $20. All you can drink. There was no age limit. He didn't ask for ID or anything like that. And they explained that some people had showed up. Apparently, they took a cup without paying for it and filled it with beer.
Michael says his sister saw them take the cup.
His sister approached them with that and asked them if they paid for that cup of beer. And one of the individuals stated to her that they weren't going to pay for it because the kegs were almost empty. So she slapped the cup out of one of the individual's hands. He called her some vulgar type words. She ended up slapping him.
Robert and Michael stated that once the people started to fight, it got out of control, and then people were fighting everywhere.
When sirens filled the air, everyone involved vanished.
With everybody either gone or hiding out somewhere, the officers decided to head back to the station.
Then, as 3 a.m. rolls around, a flurry of urgent 911 calls come into the Victoria Police Department from the same neighborhood.
There's some shooting out there. It's right on the side of our house. I live in the house and I heard it.
Okay.
One of the callers says he saw at least 2 people shooting.
Okay, so there's 2 people just by the car shooting back and forth at each other?
Yeah, I think they were shooting towards the house. They were screaming and yelling.
And then how many shots did you hear?
Over 10.
When police return, people have cleared out. It's obvious the shooters are gone.
One of the first people they talked to was the local pastor who lived at the corner. He's one of the people who reported that shots were fired.
Unfortunately, The pastor never saw who was shooting.
The officer went outside with his flashlight, looked at the house, and did discover that there were rounds that were in the wood of the house. He takes pictures of the pastor's house. He goes and he finds 13 9mm shell casings laying in the street. And there was some 22 bullets discovered and some shotgun shell casings.
Officers have no idea what's going on, who was involved, and who was doing the shooting. But they know at least 3 different guns were used.
The officers actually did a search. They walked behind people's houses. They searched everywhere. They looked to see if there was anything they could find, anybody that was injured, anything. And they found nothing. They left the scene.
Then, 6 hours later, around noon, a woman named Vivian Rivera calls Victoria Dispatch.
She tells police that her 24-year-old fiancé, Daniel Davila, was missing.
Vivian lets the police know that she last heard from Daniel between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and that he was going to a party, but Daniel never came home, and she's wondering what's going on.
Born October 26, 1986, Texas native Daniel Davila was raised with strong family values.
Daniel came from a loving, Christian, church-going family. They enjoyed a wonderful life. His parents were very hardworking.
They instilled the same work ethic in their son, and he was an auto glass tech. He worked for a company called Safe Light and did really well for himself.
In his early 20s, he was lucky enough to find his special someone.
He met a wonderful woman by the name of Vivian, and they quickly fell head over heels in love. They were inseparable.
And before long, Daniel and Vivian got engaged and started planning a life together.
Daniel was excited about his life with Vivian. He had 2 beautiful daughters.
His dreams of a picture-perfect family were coming true, and he had a bright future ahead of him.
But now Daniel is missing, and Vivian is beside herself with worry.
She said when she woke up and saw that he wasn't home, she tried to call Daniel, but he wasn't answering his phone.
She had no idea where he was, so she wanted to report him missing.
Vivian describes Daniel and says that he was last wearing a pink shirt, khaki shorts, and he has a tattoo on his arm that says Tatum.
As police prepare to launch a missing persons investigation, they suddenly receive another distressed call.
Victoria 911, where's your emergency?
We got a man out here on the ground.
In July 2011, after a massive fight occurred during a party that ended in gunshots being fired, Victoria, Texas police are now looking for missing 24-year-old Daniel Davila.
His fiancée, Vivian Rivera, said that he never came home after going to that same party.
Shortly after that, another 911 phone call came in, again from the local pastor's house.
Victoria 911, where's your emergency?
Yeah, we got a man out here on the ground.
Okay, and what is he just like passed out or what?
I don't know.
You're not too sure? Okay.
Oh my God, this boy's dead.
Officers race back out to the scene on Ash Street. When officers arrive, the pastor shows them to the side of the house.
Officers find the young man lying face down. He's wearing a pink shirt and khaki shorts, and they confirm that he's deceased.
There are no obvious wounds they can see, but officers quickly inform emergency services and detectives.
We were summoned to the area.
to start the initial investigation. We located the victim. He was laying in between a house and a shed. And then we were able to identify that the subject we had was Daniel Davila, based on pictures, and the missing persons report being filed at the same time as we were out with his body. At that point, we processed the crime scene. When we rolled him over, we saw he had a gunshot wound into his gut. We became aware of the shots fired call from the night before. So we began looking for any evidence that might connect to how this body ended up in this yard.
Investigators believe when the gunfire rang out, Daniel must have gotten hit and tried to make it home.
It looked like he had been going possibly down the alleyway or had maybe been in the storage building hiding and come out and just collapsed.
As the body is removed for an autopsy, investigators speak with Michael Gomez, who was hosting the party. He tells detectives that he knows Daniel Davila.
He says Daniel was at a club last night, but then arrived after the fight broke out, and that he showed up because he heard that a party was going on.
Michael said he heard gunshots around 3 a.m., but he didn't see a vehicle and he didn't know where the shots were coming from. So he just ran into the house.
So because Daniel Davila lived so close to them, they believed that Daniel had went home. So during that time, they were kind of in shock.
As authorities find more residents who attended the party, new details emerge.
There was one witness who saw an individual with a shotgun and about 3 other people getting into a silver car and leaving the scene.
Another witness says she saw the fight happen, but she left around the same time everyone else did when she heard the police sirens.
She also said afterwards she went to the local convenience store, and that's when she saw the same group of people there that were asked to leave the party. She said she recognized one of the guys from the group.
She was in high school, so she identified Jeffrey Hill as being another student at one of the local schools. And so that was the first lead that law enforcement had.
Within hours, police tracked down 17-year-old Jeff Hill.
I made contact with Jeffrey Hill and brought him to the police station. He agreed to provide an interview.
Jeff admits that he heard about the party on social media, and that when he arrived, that's when the fight broke out. He said that his friend, 19-year-old Josh McClure, started the fight.
He explained to them about a confrontation that Josh got slapped, which kind of goes back to what Michael Gomez said about the beer drinking and the cups.
When Josh started fighting, they started jumping him. They hit him with a beer bottle. So me and my other friend, we jumped in and tried to break it up. But like 2 or 3 grown men came out there, and then before you know it, a fight break out.
Jeff claims that he and his friends were drastically outnumbered. Then police showed up.
So everybody left. I left after the first fight.
You weren't there with them when they started shooting?
No.
Sensing Jeff knows more, the investigator puts on the pressure.
So there was shots that were fired. One of them hit a guy. But if you keep dancing around it and not telling me the truth, it's going to look real bad for you.
Jeff takes some time and thinks about it, and then he starts to tell more.
We got there and everything. Then the fight broke out. I was riding with them, but I didn't know they was going to shoot.
But you were with them when they shot?
Mm-hmm.
Who was shooting? Anytime somebody dies, whether it's natural causes or, in this case, criminal, one of the hardest parts of the job is notifying their family who don't know yet. And you never know how people are going to react. A lot of times there's disbelief. I've had the door shut in my face because they don't want to accept what's going on. I've had people just fall down. It's one of the harder parts of the job because you have to tell them and there's nothing you can do to ease their pain.
Homicide investigators in Victoria, Texas, are questioning 17-year-old Jeff Hill to find out who was shooting off guns after a fight on Ash Street that ended up killing Daniel Davila. Jeff states that it all started because of the fight that broke out involving his friend, Josh McClure.
When they left the party after the confrontation, he says Josh McClure was really angry. He wanted to retaliate.
Joshua McClure was looking for people to go back to the party with him, to back him up, because he knew that they were outnumbered if he was to go back. So at that time, Joshua McClure made a phone call.
Within no time, he says a guy named Mar arrived with a friend who he only knew as Doughboy.
Jeff said that they all piled into a few cars and drove back to where the party was.
He says when he came around the corner, some of the guys came out of the party house. And that's when the shooting started.
Who was shooting? It was a dude named Mar. And this dude, they call him Doughboy or something like that.
He claims he doesn't know their real names, and they were the only ones he saw shooting.
What were they using? Do you know what kind of guns they had?
Oh, it's pistols.
Based on the casings and bullet fragments left at the scene, investigators know that 3 guns were used, not 2. The guns were a .22, a 9mm, and a shotgun. So who was the third shooter?
Jeff was asked if he knew the person who was killed, and he said he didn't know who Daniel was.
Investigators decide to let him go for now, while they look for Josh McClure and try to figure out who Mar and Doughboy are. That evening, around 9 p.m., officers locate and bring in 19-year-old Josh McClure.
He started with, he wasn't involved, he didn't know what happened.
Okay, so, and I know there's more to this, okay?
I don't remember nothing. I don't remember anything.
Finally, Josh realizes the seriousness of his situation.
Josh eventually admitted he went back over there for the shooting.
I was on the back left.
Okay. Who's in the front right?
I think it was Mar.
What's Mar's full name?
He says Mar is 20-year-old Marcellus Brown.
Okay. Who's in the back seat? Next to you?
Jeffrey.
He also places Marcellus's girlfriend there, 30-year-old Kia Johnson.
Who's driving?
Kia. I think it was Kia. Kia was driving.
He says she was driving a silver car, which matches what a witness had seen.
So what was the plan going back over there?
I was gonna go back to fight.
Okay. When did it turn into somebody shooting?
Josh said that when they pulled up to the party house, that a bunch of guys came out and started running towards them.
Josh says that's when Marcellus pulled out his gun and started unloading on them. He also doesn't seem to know anything about Doughboy.
Josh also says he doesn't even know who Daniel is.
I asked him if he had used his phone that night to contact Marcellus Brown to go over there after the original fight, and he confirmed he had. So at that point, we seized his phone as evidence.
Investigators try to press on, but before they're able to get anything more from Josh, their interview gets interrupted.
Josh's sister, Erica McClure, shows up, and they allow her in the room with him for questioning.
She made some statements that made it obvious she had knowledge of what happened, but she was constantly trying to keep Josh from giving us any information.
They don't have you on nothing. You didn't do shit. You wasn't even there.
She tells Josh, don't talk anymore, and she takes him home.
Where your phone at?
Despite the interrogation getting cut short, detectives have enough for the arrest of Marcellus Brown.
We had both Jeffrey Hill and Joshua McClure implicate Marcellus in shooting, which we believe led to Daniel Davila's death. Both Josh and Jeff were still distancing themselves from the event.
Detectives check out Marcellus's criminal history to see who they're dealing with.
Marcellus Brown, he had a past record. He had been incarcerated before.
Turns out he was out on parole and had just got out of prison for some past drug offenses.
On Sunday, July 31st, 2011, around noon, detectives show up to his girlfriend Kia's apartment looking for him.
Since Josh said she was there at the shooting and driving her silver car, they also wanted to speak with Kia Johnson.
Born in 1980, Kia Johnson grew up in Dallas, Texas.
Kia went to church. She was an active member in her community, and she was someone that people were really fond of.
In high school, Kia met somebody, and everything was great until she found out she was pregnant in 1997.
Kia soon found herself a single mom struggling to provide for her son.
In 2006, Kia starts working at the school district cafeteria to provide for her and her son.
It wasn't always easy, but Kia made it work. She hoped to find a partner that could one day help her carry the load.
And in April 2011, Kia found everything she was looking for in 20-year-old Marcellus Mar Brown.
Kia had this instant connection with Marcellus that she had never felt before.
Even though Marcellus was younger than Kia, she felt like he was very ambitious and that he had a good head on his shoulders and that he was somebody good for her and her son.
Kia knew that Marcellus would be the perfect man to complete her family. But now it seems that future might be put on hold. 24 hours after the shooting, investigators arrive at Kia's apartment, ready to arrest her boyfriend for murder.
Kia told us that Marcellus wasn't there. We saw a car that was a silver Nissan.
So it's looking like the witnesses in Josh's statement are matching up so far.
They bring Kia to the station to ask her about the shooting. But she says investigators have it all wrong and points the finger at someone else.
I've known him to do things to people. I've known him to
we talking about
break in houses, kick door people, him and his buddies.
Detectives in Victoria, Texas, have brought in Kia Johnson, who they believe is involved with several others in the murder of Daniel Davila, an innocent victim in a retaliation attack.
She denied knowing anything about anybody being shot or the shooting.
I didn't even know what happened, and I was never at no party.
Kia informs officers that she had spent the entire day on July 29th with her boyfriend, Marcellus Brown, until about 10:30 at night.
Mar went to Lundale to his friend's house.
She did admit that Erica McClure had called her about Josh getting involved in a fight on Ash Street and getting jumped. So she claimed that she and Erica went back over to the party just to see what happened and heard people talking about Josh getting jumped and possibly coming back to fight, but then she and Erica left.
Detectives tell Kia that Josh placed her at the shooting, driving the car, and also put a gun in Marcellus's hand that night. Kia quickly denies it.
She was pretty adamant most of the time that she wasn't involved, and neither was her boyfriend, Marcellus.
I don't see murder in him at all. I watch it with my son. I don't see it. I'm sorry. I don't see it. Ain't nothing that you can tell me to make me believe that he killed somebody. I'm sorry.
Kia also informs investigators that if there's anyone they should be looking at, it's Josh.
You think Josh did it?
If you ask me, I've seen Josh in action. I've known him to do things to people. I've known him to
We talk about
break in houses, kick no people. Him and his buddies. That Jeff is one of them.
According to her, Josh and his friends have a history of getting into trouble together, and now his sister Erica is coming in to clean up his mess.
Kia says she thinks they are all trying to pin this on her and her boyfriend to save themselves. Detectives don't buy it.
Her interview, I don't think, led to a lot other than it was obviously deceptive at that point.
Then, detectives get an unexpected surprise.
Marcellus Brown called and offered to come down for an interview.
Brown said that when he was at his friend's house, that Josh McClure called him.
Talking about he just got jumped and this and that, dude. I'm like, what? What you mean you just got jumped?
Marcellus says he didn't meet up with them and stayed with his friend at his place for a while.
So after that, I went home and went to bed. I didn't never go to no party.
Marcellus was adamant that he wasn't involved at all in the fight. His alibi was that he was with a friend all night and gives the detectives that friend's name.
Unfortunately for him, when we went to confirm that with the friend claimed he hadn't been with him all that day. And so that kind of helped confirm that he wasn't telling the truth.
You were in that car. I can place you in that car. Your girlfriend's driving the damn car. And the problem is, you're gonna put her in jail too.
I'm telling you, I promise you I'm
denying you were there. No, you're not. You were there, and I can put a gun in your hand.
While we were questioning him and letting him know we knew he was involved, he decided he wanted to leave and didn't want to talk anymore. And that's the point at which we placed him under arrest for the murder.
Detectives are confident they have their man. But they're about to find out that there's much more to the story.
I haven't had a night of sleep, eat, or thought that I ain't thought about that man in the red shirt.
July 31st, 2011, Victoria, Texas. Police have arrested Marcellus Brown for the murder of Daniel Davila. But they know he's not the only one that should be sitting in jail.
We were pretty confident he was involved. We still believed other people were involved at that point.
That morning, Daniel Davila's autopsy is complete.
When we got the medical examiner's report, it confirmed that he died from a gunshot wound and that the bullet that killed him was a 9mm. That was crucial in a way because we knew the guns involved in the shooting. One was a shotgun, one was a .22 revolver, and one was a 9mm pistol.
The evidence starts to pile up when data from Josh's phone reveals some incriminating texts.
Josh tells Erica that he's going to tell the truth.
But Erica was telling Josh not to admit to anything, not to say anything.
Investigators are on the right track. But they still need more. They continue to look for the mysterious Doughboy.
Once we had Marcellus in custody, we started going back and doing further interviews with Josh, with Jeff. We interviewed Erica. Kia was interviewed again. We started interviewing witnesses.
During these interviews, they were able to confirm that Erica not only knew more than what they thought, but she was at the shooting as well.
The remaining friends all stick to their story and refuse to tell the whole truth.
I don't think they had really planned any elaborate stories together because they gave such disparate statements. I think they were all just coming up with individual stories to try to cover their involvement.
Even without their cooperation, on August 5th, 2011, detectives have enough to charge them all with engaging in organized criminal activity, discharge of a firearm, and murder.
Anytime you have a group of 3 or more that are conspiring to commit that murder, then you also have a charge of engaging in organized criminal activity.
After they are all arrested, detectives get word that Kia wants to talk.
I had denied the first time because I was afraid.
Okay.
I ain't been able to eat. I haven't been able to sleep or think.
Realizing how much trouble she was in, she finally admitted that she drove Erica, Josh, Jeff, and Marcellus to the party house and then back.
She confirmed a lot of what we already knew had happened. Erica was, I think, as upset as Josh that he got hit with a beer bottle in the fight. Marcellus was the one that Josh was really looking to get to go help him. But Kia, being Marcellus's girlfriend, I guess jumped right in with it. She drove the car for them to go over there.
So anyway, we went, and I guess they must have seen us when we came into the neighborhood.
Because immediately everybody at the party starts running across Pine Street Park to go engage them.
All I heard is from behind them, a big boom. And so I saw the guy kind of stagger, but he got up.
She claims it was Jeff Hill and Josh McClure.
When I heard that big boom, and I turned around, there was Josh with that thing in his hand. And he racked it back again and shot again. That's when Jeff shot past him. Both of them were kind of running together, but Jeffrey made sure that that guy didn't leave from that spot.
Yet she still fails to incriminate her man.
You keep leaving Marcel out of this?
This is the one time where he was just actually at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Kia says that Josh singled the guy out because he must have been the one that hit him with the beer bottle.
You know what sucks about that? The guy wasn't even at the party when they were there.
What?
He wasn't even at the party. He didn't get in a fight.
So he was an innocent bystander.
This man's innocent.
Investigators step out of the room for a while, and Kia begins to pray.
Oh, Jesus. Forgive me, Lord Jesus. Forgive me.
And when they come back in, Kia decides it's time to finally lay all her cards on the table.
So I'm going to be honest about anything that y'all ask me.
Did you see Marcellus shooting a gun?
I did.
This case was ultimately devastating because an innocent bystander who had nothing to do with the disagreement that happened has now lost his life. His daughters have to grow up without a father. And Kia, if she truly wanted to help her man, she could have helped him to reason with the situation. And this is just a sad case of when you use impulsive decision-making and you don't think through your decisions.
In the summer of 2011, Victoria, Texas police have finally made 5 arrests in connection with the murder of Daniel Davila.
Police have arrested Kia and her boyfriend Marcellus, Josh and Erica McClure, and Jeff Hill. They were charged with murder, engaging in organized criminal activity, and deadly conduct with a weapon.
That's when Kia Johnson changes her story and turns on her boyfriend.
Let me go on and get this out my chest.
Kia says after the fight, the group went to the convenience store. And then they all met up at her apartment.
Marcellus was upset that Josh had gotten beaten up in the fight and hit with a bottle. And that's kind of where they hatched the plan to go back over there with guns. Kia actually provided them with the guns.
Marcellus Brown told Kia to get them the guns that he had stashed at her house. So at that time, Kia Johnson gives a 9mm pistol to Marcellus Brown. She gives a .22 rifle to Jeffrey Hill, and she gives a shotgun to Joshua McClure.
Did you see Marcellus shooting a gun?
I did. I saw Marcellus shoot a gun.
At that point, even confirmed, Marcellus had told her later that he was shooting the 9mm, which is the gun that fired the killing bullet.
Authorities search for the guns, but they're never recovered.
As for the mystery man, only known as Doughboy, detectives believe he doesn't exist.
So we never identified Doughboy. When Jeff Hill was originally telling us who the people were in the car, he didn't want to place himself in the car because he didn't want to place himself as part of the shooting. So he needed somebody to fill his spot in the car, and I think that's why he brought up Doughboy.
With Kia's statement tying everything together, prosecutors finally have everything they need for trial.
So there were actually multiple trials because we had multiple suspects.
In September 2012, more than a year after the killing of Daniel Davila, the first trial officially begins with Marcellus Brown.
Jeff makes a deal with prosecutors and testifies against Marcellus. He testifies that he fired the .22, Marcellus fired the 9mm, and Josh fired the shotgun.
Kia also testifies against her boyfriend and explains why she helped cover for him.
Not only does she put the future of her child in jeopardy, she now puts her future in jeopardy, all because of a short-term relationship, not really even thinking about the impact that it would have.
When the jury comes back with the verdict, it's a shock to everyone.
The jury found him not guilty on murder. I think they were just having trouble deciding who held the actual gun that fired the killing shot. But they did convict him on engaging in organized criminal activity and in deadly conduct discharge firearm.
With his prior felonies, Marcellus is given a hefty sentence of 60 years. He'll be eligible for parole after 30 years.
Due to his cooperation, Jeffrey was given a plea bargain. He pleaded out to organized criminal activity and deadly conduct. Jeffrey Hill was given 8 years for each charge to run concurrently.
Josh and Erica McClure chose to be tried together, and neither were convicted of murder.
However, both were convicted for engaging in organized criminal activity and deadly conduct discharge firearm, and they both received identical sentences of 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine.
Kia Johnson pleaded out to 10 years probation. The reason for that is that Kia Johnson did cooperate with us and did tell us a lot about what had truly happened.
Then, in 2015, a judge revoked her probation for assaulting a Dallas police officer.
He then sentenced her to 30 years for the murder and 10 years for engaging in organized criminal activity.
After everything was done, I do think justice was served. While originally there weren't murder convictions.
The howling winter wind of Chicago doesn't just freeze the skin. It rattles the bones and buries the darkest secrets of the Windy City deep beneath a heavy, suffocating layer of ice and snow. On the frozen, pitch black night of February 14th, 2004, the sub-zero temperatures had completely emptied the streets of the historic, working-class neighborhood of Bridgeport, turning the concrete sidewalks into treacherous mirrors of black ice. Inside a charming, renovated two-story brick bungalow on South Low Avenue, 26-year-old elementary school teacher Sarah Jenkins was winding down after a long week, her living room illuminated only by the warm, flickering glow of a television set and a single decorative candle. The soft hum of the radiator masked the subtle, terrifying sound of the heavy wooden basement door downstairs slowly pivoting on its hinges, followed by the faint, rhythmic creak of a loose floorboard in the kitchen. It was a sound no one else heard, a predatory presence no one noticed, until the lights in the house suddenly went completely dead, plunging the interior into an absolute, terrifying darkness. By dawn, the winter storm had intensified, dropping 8 inches of fresh powder that completely blanketed the exterior footsteps, while inside, a vibrant young woman's future was violently, systematically stolen in the dark. When her concerned mother arrived the next morning after Sarah uncharacteristically failed to show up for Sunday brunch, she walked into a chilling, silent crime scene that would haunt the community for over 2 decades. Sarah lay across her living room sofa, her wrists bound with industrial zip ties, her life extinguished by a brutal, calculated manual strangulation that left the veteran responding detectives completely pale. The house was meticulously orderly, with no signs of forced entry at the front door, no valuable electronics missing, and no obvious forensic trail left behind. Only a pristine, terrifyingly clinical scene that suggested the killer possessed intimate knowledge of the home's layout and the exact vulnerabilities of its security system. The immediate shock of the discovery rippled through the tight-knit, multi-generational enclave of Bridgeport like a sudden, devastating tremor, shattering the neighborhood's long-held illusion of safety and working-class solidarity. Local newspapers instantly splashed the grim details across their front pages, screaming about the Valentine's Day nightmare, while television anchors spoke in hushed, urgent tones about a calculating predator hiding within the community's own shadows. Police barricades quickly cordoned off the entire block of South Low Avenue, their flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the high snowdrifts and the brick facades, casting long, distorted shadows against the historic homes. Forensic teams combed every square inch of the residence, dusting the antique furniture for latent fingerprints, vacuuming the rugs for trace fibers, and collecting the industrial zip ties for DNA analysis, but the perpetrator had operated with an almost supernatural precision. It was as if a phantom had materialized directly from the sub-zero wind, committed an act of unspeakable cruelty, and dissolved back into the freezing Chicago night without leaving a single microscopic footprint or a drop of biological evidence behind. Neighbors spoke of hearing absolutely nothing unusual over the roar of the winter storm, just the steady, rhythmic rattling of their own windows and the distant, muffled plow trucks clearing the main avenues. The complete absence of forced entry strongly suggested that Sarah either recognized her attacker and willingly opened her door in the dead of night, or the killer possessed a key, a realization that sent a wave of paralyzing paranoia through the quiet residential block. Lead Detective Raymond Miller, a hardened 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department's Homicide Division, stood in the freezing living room, his heavy wool trench coat dusted with snow, his eyes locked onto the couch where Sarah's body had been discovered. He felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of a neighborhood demanding immediate answers, yet the active case file remained stubbornly thin, lacking the one definitive, explosive piece of evidence needed to crack the mystery wide open. Miller ordered his team to log hundreds of hours of overtime, launching a massive, exhaustive dragnet that targeted every individual who had interacted with Sarah in the months leading up to February 2004. They interviewed her fellow teachers, her ex-boyfriends, her neighbors, and even the local delivery drivers who frequented the Bridgeport area, but every potential lead evaporated into a frustrating dead end of unverified alibis and circular timelines. The industrial zip ties used to bind her wrists were a common, mass-produced commercial brand sold by the thousands at every home improvement store across Cook County, making them virtually impossible to trace to a specific purchaser. The killer had worn heavy winter gloves, meticulously wiped down every touch surface, and had even cut the home's main power line at the exterior breaker box before entering, completely disabling the digital security cameras and leaving the investigation blind from the very start. By the time the first anniversary of the homicide arrived, the frantic, high-profile urgency of the initial investigation had completely ground to an agonizing, administrative halt against a wall of forensic dead ends. The screaming headlines faded from the front pages, swallowed by newer urban tragedies, and the public's fleeting attention shifted elsewhere, but the silent trauma of the Low Avenue bungalow remained an open, unhealed wound in the hearts of the Bridgeport community. The heavy case file grew thick, weathered and yellowed, bound in faded cardboard boxes that were eventually moved from Miller's active desk to the dusty metal cabinets of the cold case unit. Year after year, the dust settled thicker on the manila folders, a quiet monument to a historical failure that haunted the department as veterans retired and took their unverified theories to the grave. Sarah's mother passed away a decade later, her heart broken not just by the violent theft of her daughter's life, but by the cruel, permanent silence of a justice system that seemed to have abandoned Sarah's ghost to the dark archives of the forgotten. The bungalow was eventually sold, the brick exterior repainted, and new families moved into the block, entirely unaware of the chilling horror that had unfolded within those very walls during the frozen winter of 2004. The sudden, earth-shattering breakthrough did not come from a dramatic courtroom confession or a sudden deathbed revelation, but from the quiet, relentless march of science in the year 2026. A young, determined forensic analyst in the Illinois State Police Crime Lab, tasked with reviewing stagnant cold cases using next-generation technology, selected the Jenkins file for an advanced round of DNA testing. Utilizing cutting-edge MVAC wet vacuum collection systems that didn't exist in 2004, she managed to extract a microscopic, partial skin cell profile from the textured surface of the industrial zip ties, a biological trace that had been completely unreachable by the primitive swabbing techniques of the past. The extracted genetic material was immediately uploaded into the National DNA Index system, searching not just for a direct criminal match, but for familial genetic markers that could narrow down the suspect pool to a specific bloodline. Within 72 hours, the supercomputer's whirred to a halt, flashing a definitive, high-probability match that didn't point to a nomadic serial killer or a distant drifter, but to a prominent, multi-generational family that had lived on South Low Avenue for over 40 years. When the lead detectives mapped out the specific branches of that family tree, the final genetic trajectory landed squarely on a 64-year-old retired city worker named Michael Kovac, the man who lived directly next door to Sarah Jenkins on the night she was murdered. Michael Kovac was a staple of the Bridgeport neighborhood, a quiet, unassuming man who had spent his entire adult life working for the city's Department of Water Management, maintaining an unassailable profile of blue-collar respectability. To the current residents of South Low Avenue, he was the friendly, gray-haired neighbor who always shoveled the snow from the elderly residents' sidewalks and watched over the block with a vigilant, protective eye. The current cold case team, led by Detective Sarah Lindquist, stared at the modern genealogical data in absolute, stunned disbelief, realizing that the monster they had been hunting for 22 years had never fled the city, never changed his identity, and had been living just 50 feet from the crime scene this entire time. Lindquist knew that a familial DNA match on a 22-year-old piece of evidence was not enough to secure a capital indictment against a lifelong resident with deep community ties. They needed a fresh, direct, and undeniable genetic sample from Kovac himself without tipping him off. A covert, round-the-clock surveillance detail was instantly deployed to South Low Avenue, their unmarked vehicles blending into the neighborhood traffic as undercover officers watched Kovac's daily routine of walking his dog, visiting the local hardware store, and drinking coffee on his front porch. The high-stakes moment of tactical execution arrived on a crisp, rainy Tuesday morning inside a historic neighborhood diner just 3 blocks from Kovac's residence. Kovac sat alone at a corner booth, comfortably reading the morning paper and sipping hot coffee from a ceramic mug, completely oblivious to the digital net closing tightly around his perimeter. An undercover female detective, dressed as a casual commuter, sat at the adjacent table, her eyes tracking his every movement with bated breath through the reflection of the diner's glass mirror. When Kovac finished his breakfast, paid his bill in cash, and walked out into the gray Chicago drizzle, he left the used coffee mug sitting on the Formica table. The undercover officer moved with practiced, casual swiftness, sliding into the vacant booth and securing the discarded mug into a sterile forensic collection bag before the busboy could clear the table. The biological sample was rushed under emergency status to the state crime laboratory, where technicians worked through the night to sequence the fresh saliva from the rim of the mug, comparing it directly against the 2026 skin cell profile extracted from the Valentine's Day zip ties. When the laboratory computer screen flashed a definitive 99.9% positive match, an absolute, heavy silence fell over the state's cold case room. The Phantom of 2004 finally had a definitive genetic face. The tactical arrest was executed with the precision and speed of a military raid, designed to prevent any opportunity for flight, violence, or the destruction of historical trophies. At 6 a.m. on a Friday morning, multiple unmarked tactical units quietly sealed off both ends of South Low Avenue, their headlights cutting through the early morning fog as heavily armed operators moved up the stone steps of Kovac's brick bungalow. When the heavy front door was forced open, Kovac stood in his hallway, wearing a flannel bathrobe, a look of mild, irritated confusion instantly hardening into a frozen, icy realization as he stared into the barrels of the tactical team's weapons. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrinkled wrists with a sharp, historic finality, marking the total collapse of a carefully constructed 22-year illusion of innocence. As he was led down his concrete driveway in the dim morning light, an elderly neighbor fetching the morning paper stopped on her porch, her jaw dropping and open-mouthed, paralyzed shock at the sight of the block's most trusted resident being loaded into the back of a police transport. Within an hour, the digital airwaves across Illinois erupted into a frenzy of breaking news alerts, the headlines screaming across every screen. Chicago 2004 cold case solved. Victim's neighbor arrested after 22 years. Inside the stark, fluorescent-lit confines of the police headquarters interrogation room, stripped of his neighborhood camouflage and his aura of untouchable respectability, Michael Kovac sat completely motionless, his hands shackled to the center of a steel table. He initially refused to speak, his lips pressed into a thin, defiant line as Detective Lindquist systematically laid out the black and white crime scene photos from 2004 alongside the modern, colored DNA match charts. The contrast was devastating. The vibrant, frozen room of a young schoolteacher whose life was stolen, juxtaposed against the cold, undeniable scientific data that had trapped her neighbor 2 decades later. As the interrogation pressed into its 6th hour, Lindquist introduced a secondary piece of evidence that the surveillance team had just recovered from a hidden floor safe in Kovac's basement during the execution of a simultaneous search warrant, a vintage metal key that fit the side door of Sarah Jenkins' bungalow perfectly, along with a collection of her personal, missing classroom keychains. The sight of the stolen trophies broke Kovac's clinical composure, his defense mechanism permanently fracturing as he leaned forward, his voice a low, guttural growl that chilled the recording room. He didn't express remorse or beg for mercy. Instead, he detailed the precise mechanics of the 2004 murder with a level of clinical, photographic memory that shocked the observing behavioral analysts. He confessed that he had developed a silent, pathological obsession with Sarah from his adjacent window, tracking her daily routines, learning the exact layout of her home, and eventually duplicating her side door key months before the attack. On the night of Valentine's Day, fueled by a dark, unhinged need for total dominance, he used his city maintenance knowledge to cut her external power lines, entered her home in absolute darkness, and utilized the industrial zip ties to ensure her complete immobilization. He had spent the next 22 years living just feet from the scene of his atrocity, calmly watching the police cars come and go, attending the neighborhood watches, and presenting himself as a pillar of support to the community, utterly convinced that his meticulous forensic cleaning and the passage of time had made him entirely immortal. The legal proceedings that followed were a monumental, high-stakes confrontation between a high-priced defense team trying to challenge the constitutional validity of the Diner DNA collection and a prosecution armed with an airtight wall of modern science and physical trophies. The Cook County courtroom was packed to absolute maximum capacity every single day, filled with Sarah's aging former students, emotional Bridgeport residents, and true crime journalists from across the country. The defense tried desperately to argue that the skin cells on the zip ties were the result of simple environmental transfer between adjacent neighbors sharing a property line, but the scientific data was unyielding. When the jury returned with a unanimous guilty verdict for first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping after less than 2 hours of deliberation, a collective wave of tears and applause swept through the gallery, a profound release of 22 years of pent-up community grief and unresolved trauma. Kovac was sentenced to life imprisonment without the remote possibility of parole, led away to a maximum security penitentiary to exchange his comfortable brick bungalow for a sterile concrete cell. Though the prison doors have permanently shut behind Michael Kovac, the dark, chilling echo of the 2004 Low Avenue homicide refuses to release its grip on the soul of the Bridgeport community. The sensational resolution of the cold case brought no true catharsis or peaceful closure. Instead, it left behind a permanent, jagged scar of profound paranoia and institutional betrayal. The historic brick bungalows of South Low Avenue stand today as silent, haunted monuments to a generation's stolen innocence, their windows reflecting the gray Chicago winter sky, serving as a constant reminder of the monster who lived next door. Neighbors now look across their narrow shared fences with a newfound, defensive suspicion, their minds permanently infected by the terrifying knowledge that the ultimate darkness doesn't always come from an outside intruder or a random phantom in the night. Sometimes, the predator is the man who shovels your snow, the friendly face who watches your house, the neighbor who stands beside you in the light, waiting patiently for the dark to fall before cutting your world to pieces. The systematic deconstruction of Michael Kovac's 22-year illusion of innocence began within the subterranean corridors of the Chicago Police Department's Central Evidence Storage Vault, a windowless fortress smelling of ozone, desiccated cardboard, and industrialized preservation chemicals. For more than 2 decades, the physical remnants of the Valentine's Day nightmare had remained trapped in an analog stasis, locked inside heavy, wax-sealed boxes containing typed carbon copies, handwritten detective scratch pads, and grainy Polaroid photos that failed to capture the true, terrifying dimensions of the predator who lived next door. Now, under the unyielding white glare of 2026 forensic workstation illumination, a specialized task force consisting of digital evidence technicians, molecular biologists, and federal behavioral analysts were resetting the clock on the Bridgeport homicide, turning a stagnant cold case into an active, high-velocity war room. Detective Sarah Lindquist stood at the center of the room, her eyes tracing a massive digital matrix projected onto the glass wall, a timeline that sought to map out Kovac's 40-year history of residential stability against a wider, darker web of unexplained local tragedies. The immediate priority for the technical team was to verify the absolute integrity of the biological profile extracted from the industrial zip ties via the MVAC wet vacuum system. Because the defense was already preparing a massive institutional challenge, forensic analysts worked in pairs, their movements recorded by dual high-definition cameras to document a flawless, unbroken chain of custody. The MVAC system, which utilizes a pressurized sterile solution to agitate and dislodge microscopic skin cells deep within the porous, textured crevices of plastics, had yielded a remarkably dense sample of genetic material. Unlike standard cotton swabs, which merely scratch the surface and often leave behind ancient, trapped cells, the wet vacuum had pulled a pristine cellular profile that had been sealed beneath the tight plastic ridges of the zip tie locking mechanism since the winter of 2004. This was not an environmental transfer sample. This was a localized, high-density cluster of epithelial cells left by the individual who had physically wrapped the plastic straps around Sarah Jenkins' wrists, pulling them tight until the notches clicked into place. As the laboratory technicians finalized the sequencing data, An active surveillance team maintained a suffocating grid over the South Low Avenue block, ensuring that Michael Kovac remained entirely oblivious to the forensic net tightening around his brick bungalow. Undercover vehicles, disguised as commercial delivery trucks, city water management vans, and private contractor vehicles, rotated through the neighborhood streets every 3 hours to prevent the target from noticing a recurring pattern. Kovac's daily routine was observed with a clinical, chilling precision. At 7:15 a.m., he would step onto his front porch to check the weather, leaning heavily on the wooden railing as he stared over at Sarah's former property. At 9 a.m., he would walk his golden retriever down toward Palmisano Park, stopping to exchange brief, cheerful pleasantries with neighbors who still viewed him as the patriarch of the street. At 2 p.m., he would sit in his backyard workshop, his silhouette visible through the frosted glass windows as he meticulously cleaned his vintage collection of antique plumbing tools. The juxtaposition between his public persona of an aging, benevolent civic worker and the dark, operational reality of his past created a profound, sickening tension within the surveillance team. They were watching a man who had spent 22 years watching the consequences of his own atrocity from his living room window. When the search warrants for his residence were secretly cleared by a Cook County Circuit judge under a high-security seal, tactical units moved into staging positions inside an abandoned commercial warehouse near 35th Street, waiting for the laboratory to return the final comparison metrics from the diner coffee mug. The operational plan required absolute synchronization. The moment the DNA match hit the system, Kovac had to be taken down in the street before he could return to his home, where investigators suspected he maintained a hidden arsenal of personal weapons and historical souvenirs from his life in the dark. The technical breakthrough arrived at 11:32 p.m. on Thursday night, when the State Crime Lab's automated sequencing software completed its comparative analysis between the fresh saliva sample lifted from the ceramic mug and the ancient epithelial cell data extracted from the zip ties. The monitor inside the war room didn't just show a generic match. It displayed a flawless, unassailable alignment across all 24 core short tandem repeat (STR) loci utilized by the Federal Criminal Justice Grid. The mathematical probability that the biological material on the Valentine's Day bindings belonged to any other human male on the planet was calculated at 1 in 11 trillion, an absolute, scientific certainty that transformed a 22-year mystery into an immediate execution order. Lindquist grabbed her tactical jacket, her radio crackling to life as she issued the operational command to the units waiting in Bridgeport. The match is confirmed. Target is active. Move to primary intercept positions. The tactical arrest on Friday morning was executed with a terrifying, calculated violence designed to completely paralyze Kovac's defensive instincts before he could access his city-issued knowledge of the neighborhood's underground infrastructure. As Kovac stepped off his concrete porch to begin his morning walk, his dog trotting beside him on a red nylon leash, 3 unmarked black utility vehicles tore around the corner of South Low Avenue, their tires screaming against the wet asphalt as they boxed him into the sidewalk. Heavily armed operators from the CPD's Fugitive Apprehension Unit swarmed the pavement, their weapons drawn, their voices a deafening, coordinated roar that shattered the quiet morning air. Police, get on the ground. Face down. Hands behind your back. Kovac froze, the red leash slipping from his fingers, his eyes widening with a sudden, icy realization as he looked into the tactical shields. He didn't fight. He slowly dropped to his knees, allowing his arms to be pulled behind his back as the steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a heavy, historic resonance that marked the absolute end of his 40-year camouflage. Simultaneously, a secondary tactical entry team forced the front doors of his brick bungalow, their flashlights cutting through the dim, immaculate interior as they began the highly invasive process of executing the structural search warrant. While neighbors flooded the sidewalks in a state of open-mouthed, paralyzed disbelief, forensic specialists descended into Kovac's basement, a dark, concrete space that smelled heavily of motor oil, damp earth, and industrial solder. It was a space designed for concealment, its walls lined with floor-to-ceiling wooden shelving units packed with vintage city blueprints, water main schematics, and heavy steel toolboxes. Technicians utilizing ground-penetrating radar and high-intensity luminol scanners spent hours scanning the concrete floor, looking for anomalies beneath the surface that could indicate the presence of hidden vaults or historic human remains. The discovery that permanently broke the defense's potential narrative occurred behind a false brick panel located inside the home's old coal chute room. A technician noticed a slight, asymmetrical variation in the mortar lines around the base of the foundation wall. When they struck the bricks with a heavy mallet, the panel gave way, revealing a small, built-in steel fire safe wrapped in industrial plastic seals to prevent moisture damage. Inside the safe, sitting atop a neat stack of vintage Chicago cash certificates, lay a collection of items that turned the cold case into a multi-jurisdictional nightmare. A heavy, vintage brass master key stamped with the registration code of the Chicago Board of Education, a collection of handmade laminated student flashcards bearing the name Ms. Jenkins' second-grade class, and 3 separate sets of women's silver charm bracelets that had never been cataloged in any local burglary reports. The master key was the missing link that explained the complete lack of forced entry that had baffled Detective Raymond Miller in the winter of 2004. As a senior maintenance worker for the Department of Water Management, Kovac had possessed near-unlimited access to city facility keys, including those used by the public school district where Sarah taught. He hadn't just watched her through his windows. He had used his institutional position to steal her classroom keys months before the crime, utilizing his professional access to study her personal locks and craft a duplicate that allowed him to walk through her side door with the absolute ease of an invited guest. The laminated flashcards and the charm bracelets were his trophies, the physical markers of his secret conquests, preserved in the dark like biological specimens, proving that his predatory behavior was not a spontaneous explosion of violence, but a systematic, lifelong campaign of hidden collection. Back in the interrogation room, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, psychological intensity. Kovac sat stripped of his flannel bathrobe, wearing a standard orange transport jumpsuit that made his gray hair look unnaturally stark against his pale, wrinkled skin. He kept his hands clasped over the center of the steel table, his eyes remaining fixed on the concrete floor as Lindquist lined up the high-resolution images of the hidden safe's contents directly in front of his face. "Michael," Lindquist said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that cut through the steady hum of the room's digital recorders. "The safe belongs to you. The master key belongs to you. The flashcards from Sarah's classroom belong to you. You didn't just live next door to her. You lived inside her life before you stole it. The science has caught you, and your trophies have condemned you. Tell me about the other names on those bracelets." Kovac slowly tilted his head upward, his eyes locking onto Lindquist with an intensity that was pure, frozen, and completely devoid of human empathy. A faint, low growl escaped his throat, a sound that gradually transformed into a dry, condescending chuckle that chilled the blood of the observing behavioral analysts behind the two-way mirror. "You think you've uncovered a mystery, Detective," Kovac whispered, his voice carrying the rough, gritty resonance of a man who had spent 40 years working in the underground pipes of a city. "You look at your DNA charts, your metal keys, and your laminated cards, and you think you've caught a common criminal. But you don't understand the geography of Bridgeport. This neighborhood was built on blood, concrete, and silence. Sarah Jenkins was a beautiful girl, but she didn't belong on Low Avenue. She wanted to open the windows. She wanted to bring the world into her classroom. She wanted to change things that had been set in stone for generations. I didn't destroy her. I simply restored the natural order of the block. I took her keys because they were my keys. I walked through her house because it was my neighborhood. I spent 22 years watching her mother cry on that porch, and I never said a word because I knew that time was my ally. You can lock up this old bone, Detective, but you can never wash my signature out of the concrete of that street." The explicit admission of his total, unyielding narcissism was a profound victory for the prosecution, completely neutralizing any future defense attempts to frame the crime as a product of sudden cognitive decline or environmental cross-contamination. The behavioral analysts noted that Kovac displayed all the classic traits of an organized, territorial predator: a man who viewed his immediate neighborhood as his private kingdom and his neighbors as resources to be utilized or eliminated based on his internal calculations of power and control. The investigation was rapidly expanding, with federal units tracking the history of the silver charm bracelets through missing persons clearinghouses across the Midwest, realizing that the Phantom of South Low Avenue may have used his city vehicle to scout targets throughout Cook County for 3 decades, leaving behind a trail of empty frames that the city was only now beginning to see. The formal entry of the grand jury indictment against Michael Kovac transformed the quiet residential block of South Low Avenue from a scene of lingering historical trauma into the absolute epicenter of a modern legal and forensic siege. Inside the Cook County Criminal Courthouse, a towering, grim fortress of limestone and dark wood located at 26th and California, the atmosphere was charged with the high-stakes electricity of an unprecedented constitutional showdown. Outside the building, the frozen Chicago air buzzed with the engines of satellite television trucks, their thick black cables snaking across the concrete steps like lines of ink on a map. Inside the state's attorney's specialized homicide war room, District Attorney Carolyn Vance stood before a massive electronic matrix that had completely consumed the central conference wall. The display was a chilling tapestry of digital map overlays, city employment records, and black-and-white crime scene archives, all connected by a web of sharp red vectors that linked Michael Kovac's 40-year career with the Department of Water Management to a dark cluster of cold cases across the city. Vance knew that a grand jury indictment was merely a tactical beachhead, not a guarantee of a final conviction before a modern Chicago jury. The defense team, heavily financed by an association of retired municipal workers determined to protect their pension structures from the radioactive fallout of a capital conviction, had mobilized a legal defense team led by Marcus Thorne, a legendary, silver-haired trial attorney known for his ability to dismantle complex forensic science on narrow, aggressive Fourth Amendment grounds. Thorne's strategy was clear from his very first pretrial filings. He would not attempt to present Kovac as an innocent victim or a friendly neighbor. Instead, he would launch a savage, scorched-earth campaign against the legal validity of the diner surveillance operation, while simultaneously weaponizing the neighborhood's complex structural geography to cast doubt on the origin of the cellular DNA found on the industrial zip ties. The pretrial suppression hearings became an immediate obsession for the local legal and media communities, turning Courtroom 503 into a nightly segment on the evening news. Thorne filed a comprehensive, 300-page motion to suppress all physical evidence recovered from the ceramic coffee mug, arguing that the undercover surveillance team had engaged in an unconstitutional, warrantless search of Kovac's private biological data. He argued that a citizen does not forfeit their genetic privacy simply by stepping into a neighborhood diner, and that the act of leaving a coffee cup on a commercial table did not constitute an explicit abandonment of one's fundamental constitutional rights. The state did not seize a piece of discarded garbage, Thorne argued before the bench, his voice booming through the silent chamber. They seized a citizen's absolute genetic blueprint, the most private, sacred data a human being possesses, without a warrant, using a piece of diner crockery as a forensic trap. If this court sanctions this behavior, no citizen can safely drink a glass of water in a public space without risking their genetic code being uploaded into a police database. To counter Thorne's aggressive constitutional maneuvering, Carolyn Vance and Detective Sarah Lindquist spent 48 hours locked inside the state's digital evidence repository, working with cyberforensic specialists to construct a timeline that would anchor the diner collection firmly within the boundaries of established Supreme Court precedent. They introduced the diner's explicit commercial policies into the record, demonstrating that the restaurant operated on a rapid turnover system where all items left on tables were immediately cleared, processed, and discarded into public waste streams by the bus staff. Vance argued that the moment Kovac paid his bill in cash, walked out the door into the Chicago rain, and left the property behind without making any attempt to secure or retain the mug, he had legally and physically abandoned the object to the public domain, rendering it fair game for any individual, including an undercover officer, to collect. The legal chess match intensified when Vance introduced a secondary piece of evidence that completely undermined Thorne's defense of accidental environmental transfer. The defense had planned to argue that because Kovac and Sarah Jenkins shared a property line for over 2 years, sharing a wooden fence and a narrow gangway where wind currents could easily deposit microscopic skin cells onto common household areas, the presence of his DNA on the zip ties was a natural byproduct of residential proximity. But the state's chief molecular biologist, Dr. Angela Reese, took the stand with a digital presentation that displayed a high-magnification, three-dimensional model of the plastic zip ties under a scanning electron microscope. Dr. Reese demonstrated that the highest concentration of Kovac's epithelial cells was not found on the smooth, external surface of the plastic bands, where environmental wind currents or accidental contact would normally deposit trace fibers. Instead, the biological material was localized deep within the internal, mechanical teeth of the locking mechanism, the precise, recessed structural valleys where the serrated plastic strap feeds through the locking cube, creating a high-friction, grinding resistance as the restraint is pulled tight. This is not an environmental smudge, Dr. Reese testified with absolute, scientific clarity. These skin cells were sheared off a human hand under intense physical pressure. They were packed into the locking tracks at the exact moment the strap was pulled taut around the victim's wrists, sealing the biological material inside a dark, airtight plastic vault that protected it from 33 years of exposure. The individual who left the sample didn't just touch the zip tie, they pulled it until it could not go any further. The scientific absolute of the microscopic data fell upon the courtroom like a physical blow, completely neutralizing Thorne's environmental defense and forcing the judge to deny the motion to suppress. The physical evidence was ruled entirely admissible, a monumental victory for the state that effectively locked the genetic match into the historical record. But the defense team immediately pivoted to their secondary, more volatile line of defense. They filed an emergency motion demanding a total suspension of the trial based on the rapid, catastrophic collapse of Michael Kovac's physical and neurological health inside the medical wing of the Cook County Jail. As the summer of 2026 arrived, turning the concrete alleys of Bridgeport into humid corridors of gray heat, Kovac's physical framework was undergoing a profound disintegration. Deprived of the rigid, comforting routine of his neighborhood existence and the private sanctuary of his basement workshop, his cardiovascular system was failing, his aging heart slipping into chronic, erratic rhythms that required constant technological monitoring. He spent his days confined to a high-security hospital bed, hooked up to intravenous lines and a digital heart monitor, his thin arms bruised from repeated clinical blood draws. Yet, despite his physical frailty, his psychological posture remained entirely untouched. He refused to speak to the facility's court-appointed psychiatrists, spending his hours staring out the reinforced glass window of his ward toward the southern horizon, his fingers tapping a steady, rhythmic, mechanical cadence against the steel frame of his bed. The state's chief forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Jonathan Cross, spent 2 weeks attempting to complete a comprehensive mental competency evaluation of the 71-year-old defendant. His final, classified report, leaked to the investigative press in fragmented, terrifying summaries, described a mind that possessed a terrifying, clinical degree of spatial and historical organization. The defendant does not suffer from any recognizable form of organic cognitive decline or delusion, Dr. Cross wrote in his diagnostic evaluation. He possesses an absolute, photographic memory regarding the spatial layout, the utility grids, and the personal routines of every inhabitant on the Low Avenue block. He views his immediate geographic territory through the lens of a municipal engineer, treating human beings as mere components within a larger, mechanical system that he has a right to regulate. He feels zero remorse because, within his internal psychology, his actions were not crimes. They were simple, necessary administrative adjustments to maintain the absolute security and isolation of his personal kingdom. This chilling evaluation set the stage for the official commencement of the trial, a proceeding that promised to be a profound, systemic confrontation between the analog secrets of the early 2000s and the unyielding, digital tools of modern detection. The prosecution began finalizing their final witness sequence, a list that included not only the forensic scientists who had extracted the cells from the plastic teeth, but also a long procession of aging Bridgeport residents, former city workers, neighborhood watch captains, and childhood friends of Sarah Jenkins who would reconstruct the vibrant, doomed life of the young schoolteacher. The ghost of South Low Avenue was finally walking into the center of the courtroom, her own stolen keys and the classroom trophies recovered from the hidden safe serving as the ultimate, unyielding anchor that would drag her next-door neighbor out of his illusion of respectability and down into the dark, concrete floor of a state penitentiary. The opening statements of the people of the state of Illinois versus Michael Kovac commenced on a morning when a brutal, low-hanging fog rolled off Lake Michigan, swallowing the towering limestone facade of the Cook County Criminal Courthouse in a cold, damp shroud. Inside courtroom 503, the air was thick with the suffocating pressure of a historic reckoning. Every hard oak bench was packed to its absolute legal capacity with international crime reporters, aging members of the Bridgeport municipal unions, and tech workers who now inhabited the gentrified bungalows of South Low Avenue. District Attorney Carolyn Vance approached the podium with a slow, measured stride that commanded immediate, absolute silence. She didn't begin her address by invoking the cutting-edge wet vacuum technology of 2026 or the dramatic nature of the diner surveillance operation. Instead, she adjusted her microphone and held up a single, high-resolution photograph of Sarah Jenkins smiling in her second-grade classroom just days before her life was violently stolen. Vance painted a vivid, Dawn Dapp portrait of a young woman who represented the absolute future of her community, a dedicated teacher whose home was supposed to be a sanctuary of safety and peace. Then, the prosecutor's voice dropped to a low, chilling register as she turned her torso to look directly at the defense table, pointing a rigid, unyielding finger at the elderly man sitting in a specialized medical wheelchair. The defendant did not see a neighbor when he looked through his bedroom window on Valentine's Day in 2004, Vance declared, her voice vibrating through the courtroom speakers like a hammer against steel. He saw an obstacle to his absolute control. He saw a vibrant, independent young woman whose light he decided to systematically extinguish in the absolute dark. He did not just enter her home. He used his city-issued access to duplicate her keys, cut her external power lines, and bind her wrists with industrial ties that he pulled until they could go no further. For 22 years, he believed the Chicago snow had buried his signature. But today, the science he couldn't anticipate will prove that his identity was permanently sealed inside the teeth of those very restraints. When Marcus Thorne stood up for the defense's opening statement, the psychological atmosphere in the chamber shifted from emotional outrage to cold, clinical deconstruction. Thorne was a master of legal skepticism, his posture completely relaxed, his voice projecting a smooth, soothing authority designed to lower the immense stakes for the 12 jurors. He did not attempt to romanticize Michael Kovac or minimize the horrific nature of the classroom trophies recovered from the basement safe. Instead, he sought to frame the entire prosecution as a desperate, technology-driven witch hunt orchestrated by an embattled police department trying to salvage a 22-year-old failure at the expense of an aging, dying man's constitutional rights. He argued that the cellular material recovered from the internal tracks of the zip ties was an unreliable artifact, a microscopic trace that could have been transferred through any number of mundane, neighborly interactions over a shared property fence before the modern storage protocols of 2026 were implemented. They are asking you to condemn a lifelong civic servant based on invisible particles and a piece of diner crockery, Thorne countered, his eyes locking onto the jury box. They want to substitute digital graphics for absolute, reasonable doubt. The prosecution's first active witness was Detective Sarah Lindquist, who walked to the stand carrying a heavy, clear display container containing the physical safe recovered from behind the false brick panel in Kovac's basement coal chute room. The courtroom lights were dimmed, and the massive high-definition monitors behind the witness box came alive with the forensic recovery videos filmed on the morning of the tactical raid. The gallery watched in absolute, breathless horror as the digital camera tracked the crowbars fracturing the old mortar lines, revealing the hidden concrete vault and the plastic-wrapped steel container. Lindquist described the immaculate structure of the basement workshop, explaining how the defendant's professional knowledge of municipal engineering had been utilized to construct a concealment system that had successfully evaded standard police sweeps for over 2 generations. Cross stepped forward, requesting permission to display the contents of the hidden safe to the jury. As the high-resolution images of the stolen trophies appeared on the screens, a collective wave of gasps and muffled sobs swept through the front rows of the gallery. The laminated student flashcards bearing the handwritten inscription, Ms. Jenkins' second-grade class, were displayed alongside 3 separate sets of women's silver charm bracelets that had been preserved in the dark like biological specimens. Lindquist testified that every single item had been analyzed under a spectral comparator, proving that the chemical composition of the ink and the laminate plastic matched the exact teaching supplies found in Sarah's classroom at Bridgeport Elementary in the winter of 2004. The physical link between the killer's subterranean vault and the victim's professional life was forged in unassailable stone. The tactical momentum of the trial reached a state of explosive intensity during the second week when the prosecution called its chief molecular geneticist, Dr. Alan Vance, to explain the wet vacuum collection process that had extracted Kovac's cellular profile from the internal tracks of the industrial restraints. Vance utilized an interactive, 3-dimensional digital model of the zip tie locking mechanism to guide the jury through the internal physics of the plastic strap, demonstrating how the serrated notches create an intense, grinding friction as they feed through the locking cube. The epithelial cells recovered from this evidence are not the result of an accidental touch or an environmental transfer, Dr. Vance testified with absolute scientific finality. The gold-zinc particles of our 2026 sequencing systems adhered exclusively to dense clusters of skin tissue that were literally sheared off a human hand under immense physical pressure. The genetic markers matched the DNA lifted from the defendant's coffee mug with a mathematical probability of 1 in 11 trillion. There is no laboratory error, no storage degradation, and no cross-contamination that can alter the fact that Michael Kovac's hand was the one that pulled those restraints until they locked around Sarah Jenkins' wrists. Thorne's cross-examination of Dr. Vance was a savage, multi-hour assault on the history of the Cook County evidence storage facilities. He produced old logistical logs from the mid-2000s showing that the box containing the Valentine's Day ties had been relocated 3 separate times during facility renovations, arguing that the seals had been compromised and that the evidence had been handled by ungloved clerks whose identities were completely lost to history. But Vance remained entirely unshakable, his calm, clinical explanations systematically neutralizing Thorne's technical challenges. He demonstrated that the specific genetic sample was locked inside the internal, recessed channels of the locking mechanism, a space that could only be accessed by physically destroying the zip tie structure, proving that the cells were deposited by the perpetrator during the commission of the homicide and had remained sealed in an airtight plastic tomb until the wet vacuum extraction of 2026. The emotional climax of the state's case occurred on the 11th day of testimony when the prosecution introduced the original, handwritten logbooks of Detective Raymond Miller, the original homicide veteran who had investigated the crime scene in 2004 and had since passed away. Because Miller could not speak from the grave, his words were read aloud by his surviving partner, a retired detective named Thomas Burke. The courtroom grew entirely cold as Burke's voice, heavy with age and historical regret, filled the chamber, reading the notes Miller had written in the immediate hours following the discovery of Sarah's body. The scene on Low Avenue makes the skin crawl, Burke read from the yellowed pages of the logbook, the words echoing through the silent room like a voice from a past generation. There is a terrifying cleanliness to this house. No forced entry, no broken windows, no missing electronics. The killer didn't kick the door down. He walked in with a key. He knew the breaker box was outside on the south wall. He cut the main line in absolute darkness, knowing exactly where she would be sleeping. He didn't leave a single footprint in the snow outside because he entered through the shared gangway from the adjacent property. I looked out the kitchen window today and realized the neighbor's house has a direct, unobstructed line of sight into Sarah's living room. Someone has been sitting in the dark, watching this girl through the glass, learning her life until he knew her vulnerabilities better than she knew them herself. If the answer isn't on the street, we are chasing a phantom into the dark. Throughout the entire process, Michael Kovac sat perfectly motionless in his specialized medical wheelchair, his heart monitor humming softly beside him, his physical presence a withered, fragile shadow of the calculated predator described in the testimonies. Yet, His eyes remained terrifyingly alive, two black pools of absolute, unyielding intelligence that darted across the room, analyzing the faces of the jurors, the movements of the prosecutors, and the graphic exhibits with the detached, curious expression of an engineer inspecting a municipal water system. He didn't flinch at the autopsy photographs, nor did he look away when Miller's journals were read aloud. Instead, a faint, near-invisible twitch appeared at the corner of his wrinkled lips whenever a witness described the clinical precision of the crime, a silent, monstrous validation of his own hidden legacy that made the observing behavioral analysts in the front row shiver with a profound, diagnostic certainty. The prosecution was pulling the net closed. The analog secrets of 2004 were being decoded by the digital science of 2026, and the city of Chicago was about to witness the final, explosive confrontation as the defense prepared to launch its final move to protect the monster of Bridgeport from the absolute weight of historical justice. The transition from the prosecution's devastating presentation of Detective Raymond Miller's historical logbooks to the opening of the defense's active case turned Courtroom 503 into a battlefield of extreme medical and legal maneuvering. Marcus Thorne knew that the structural foundations of his standard defense had been completely pulverized by the scientific certainty of the gold-zinc wet vacuum DNA extraction and the chilling, physical reality of the classroom trophies recovered from the basement coal chute. The courtroom gallery sat in an expectant, breathless hush on the 12th morning of the trial, the air thick with the smell of heavy summer rain that beat relentlessly against the high, limestone windows of the Cook County Courthouse. Thorne stood at the podium, his face a calculated mask of professional sorrow and medical concern, as he turned his back on the jury box to look directly at the withered, fragile figure of his client. The defense strategy was no longer about establishing an alibi or creating doubt about the shared Bridgeport gangway. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble centered on the absolute physical and cognitive dissolution of the man who had allegedly engineered the most cold-blooded crime on South Low Avenue. Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Eris Thornvon, Chief of Neurological Pathology at the University of Chicago Medical Center, Thorne announced, his voice projecting a calm, clinical authority designed to steer the jury away from the emotional weight of Sarah Jenkins' stolen classroom items. A sharp, elegant woman in her mid-50s stepped up to the witness stand, her posture radiating the unassailable prestige of academic medicine. She carried a digital tablet containing a series of high-resolution, three-dimensional brain scans that were instantly projected onto the massive courtroom monitors. The images showed a human brain riddled with dark, hollowed-out gaps and severe cortical atrophy, a landscape of neurological decay that looked like a map of a city destroyed by a slow-motion bombardment. Thorne approached the witness box, his hands slipped casually into his pockets to project an aura of relaxed, unshakable confidence. Dr. Thornvon, please explain to the jury what we are looking at on these monitors and describe your recent diagnostic evaluation of the defendant, Michael Kovac. The pathologist cleared her throat, her voice adopting the detached, objective tone of a scientist reviewing laboratory data. These are advanced functional MRI and PET scans of Mr. Kovac's brain, completed within the last 10 days at the jail's secure medical unit, she explained, pointing a digital laser at the prominent dark voids in the frontal and temporal lobes. The diagnostic indicators are absolute and irreversible. Mr. Kovac is in the terminal stages of frontotemporal dementia, complicated by severe cerebral ischemia resulting from his advanced cardiovascular decline. This specific pathology causes a total, structural destruction of the neural pathways responsible for impulse control, moral reasoning, and the accurate retrieval of historical memory. The witness turned toward the jury, her expression completely devoid of personal bias. To expect a mind in this state of advanced organic decay to provide an accurate, reliable account of events that occurred 22 years ago is a medical impossibility. What the prosecution labels as a chilling, calculated confession during his initial interrogation was not an accurate retrieval of historical truth. It was a classic manifestation of confabulation. In patients suffering from terminal FTD, the brain automatically fabricates highly detailed, narrative structures to fill the massive, terrifying voids left by memory loss. Mr. Kovac has spent decades working as a municipal laborer, consuming local neighborhood gossip and news specials about the Valentine's Day nightmare. His decaying mind has absorbed the details of Sarah Jenkins' death, internalizing them until he truly believes he was the architect of the crime. He is not a master criminal playing a game. He is a dying, profoundly demented man living inside a neurological hallucination. The explanation was delivered with such flawless, scientific plausibility that a ripple of intense unease passed through the prosecution's table. Marcus Thorne capitalized on the moment immediately, guiding the witness through an exhaustive, multi-hour review of Kovac's historical city medical charts, demonstrating that his physical and cognitive decline had been documented by municipal health clinics long before his arrest in 2026. He sought to frame the entire police interrogation not as a triumph of justice, but as a predatory exploitation of an old, dying man whose decaying brain was eager to please the aggressive detectives by reciting the dark folklore of the Bridgeport neighborhood. By the time Thorne sat down, he had managed to introduce a powerful, deeply unsettling counter-narrative, an alternative reality where the state was attempting to condemn a man not for what he did in 2004, but for the tragic, uncontrollable delusions of his terminal illness. But the atmosphere of clinical skepticism vanished instantly the moment District Attorney Carolyn Vance rose for her cross-examination. She didn't approach the podium. Instead, she walked directly to the evidence table, picking up the heavy canvas bag containing the vintage, handwritten logbooks and city water main schematics recovered from Kovac's basement safe, the records written in that tight, microscopic script that spanned decades. She dropped the heavy binders onto the witness rail right in front of Dr. Thornvaughn with a loud, definitive thud that echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Dr. Thornvaughn, Vance began, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that commanded immediate, absolute attention. You have given us a fascinating lecture on the tragedies of human dementia. So, let us test your medical theories against the continuous, uninterrupted execution of a 22-year obsession written by the defendant's own hand. Vance opened one of the vintage journals to a page dated February 14, 2009, exactly 5 years after Sarah Jenkins' death. I am reading from an entry written when the defendant was 54 years old, decades before any neural atrophy occurred. He writes, "The anniversary on Low Avenue passed in total silence. The snow fell from the northeast, exactly as it did 5 years ago. I reviewed the classroom cards in the basement safe tonight. The laminate still holds her scent perfectly. The police are still searching for a phantom in the outer wards. They don't understand that a true neighborhood gatekeeper doesn't leave his keys in the street. He keeps them in the dark where the years cannot fade the property line. Tell me, doctor, is it your expert medical opinion that a 54-year-old active senior water management supervisor, operating a complex utility grid with mathematical precision, was also suffering from terminal confabulation when he recorded the exact weather patterns and structural metrics of his crimes?" Objection. Thorne shouted, slamming his palm onto the defense table. The prosecutor is mischaracterizing the medical timeline. The journals have not been authenticated as an uninterrupted psychological record. Overruled. The judge snapped, his eyes fixed with an intense, unyielding focus on the witness stand. The witness will answer the question based on her diagnostic expertise. Dr. Thornvaughn adjusted her glasses, her professional composure fracturing slightly under Vance's fierce, uncompromising gaze. If the journals are authentic and contemporaneous, the pathologist admitted, her voice losing its previous academic certainty, then they would indicate a highly organized, long-term cognitive fixation that predates his current neurological degeneration. However, his current state remains terminal, and his modern admissions are still heavily compromised by his organic decay. Vance didn't give the witness a single second to recover, driving her questions forward with Dawn Dapp, rapid-fire precision that cut through the defense's medical camouflage like a tactical knife. Let us speak of his modern state then, doctor. You say his brain cannot accurately retrieve historical truth. Let us look at how his decaying mind operated on the morning of his arrest in April 2026. When the tactical team swarmed South Low Avenue, They found that the defendant had already withdrawn his entire life savings in cashier's checks, packed an industrial field kit with municipal master keys, and cleared his home's digital footprint. He did not behave like a confused, demented old man wandering through a historical hallucination. He behaved like a highly disciplined, terrifyingly self-aware predator who knew the net was pulling tight around his subterranean vault. He didn't prepare to flee because he was confused, Doctor. He prepared to flee because the modern 2026 DNA science had stripped away his invisibility, and his instinct for survival was as sharp and lethal as the hands he used to pull those industrial ties until they choked out Sarah Jenkins' life. The courtroom was completely breathless, all eyes anchored on the witness box as the defense's medical narrative disintegrated under the weight of the active, operational facts of the case. Vance turned away from the witness, her boots making a sharp, rhythmic snapping sound against the hardwood floor as she walked over to the defense table, stopping just inches from Michael Kovac's medical wheelchair. The defendant sat perfectly still, his heart monitor providing a rhythmic, mechanical hum that contrasted with the pale, translucent quality of his wrinkled skin. But as Vance stood over him, Kovac slowly tilted his chin upward, his lips parting into that slow, jagged smile that had chilled the detectives on the night of his arrest. His black eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that was pure, frozen, and completely undemented, a look of such absolute, unvarnished defiance that it filled the entire room with a physical weight. He didn't look like a victim of organic decay. He looked like a sovereign ruler who was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of his own exposure, a monster who believed that his lifetime of hidden dominance placed him entirely beyond the moral comprehension of the citizens who sat in judgment of his flesh. The psychological warfare inside the courtroom reached a state of frozen, terrifying clarity as Dr. Eris Thornvon stepped down from the witness stand, her academic authority utterly dismantled by the prosecution's relentless operational timeline. The defense table sat in a state of grim, heavy silence, the high-priced legal team surrounding Michael Kovac looking less like defenders of an innocent man and more like a cleanup crew at a catastrophic train wreck. Marcus Thorne stood at the podium, his posture noticeably stiffened, his fingers tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm against the wood of the lectern. He knew his medical defense had been completely hollowed out by Vance's fierce cross-examination. The illusion of a confused, demented old man had been stripped away, leaving behind the dark, unyielding reality of a highly organized, lethal predator who had outsmarted the state for 22 years. With his back firmly against the legal wall, Thorne made the ultimate, most dangerous move available in the modern American justice system. He decided to let the monster speak for himself. "Your Honor," Thorne announced, his voice dropping into a low, solemn register that made the packed gallery lean forward in unison. The defense calls Michael Kovac to the stand. A collective intake of breath rattled through the courtroom like a sudden winter wind. Court officers instantly shifted into high alert formations, 3 heavily armed deputies stepping into the well of the court to escort the wheelchair-bound defendant toward the witness box. The mechanical hum of his heart and vital monitors seemed to amplify in the silence, a rhythmic, electronic pulse that sounded like the respirations of the historic building itself. As the deputies locked the wheels of his medical chair beside the witness rail, Kovac slowly lifted his hands, his wrinkled, oil-stained fingers clasping together over his lap with a chilling, serene composure. He did not look at his defense attorney, nor did he look at the judge. Instead, his black, piercing eyes locked onto the jury box, sweeping across the faces of the 12 citizens of Chicago with the clinical, calculating intensity of a water management supervisor inspecting a municipal utility system. Thorne approached the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps, attempting to establish a calm, non-threatening cadence that would allow his client to project an aura of vulnerable, historical exhaustion. "Mr. Kovac," Thorne began, his voice soft, almost paternal. "You have sat through 3 weeks of graphic, devastating testimony. You have heard yourself described as a phantom, a manipulator, and a cold-blooded territorial predator. I want to ask you, under oath, to look at this jury today and tell them the truth about what happened on the night of February 14th, 2004, inside the bungalow on South Low Avenue." Kovac tilted his head slightly, his thinning, silver hair shifting away from his face to reveal the sharp, deeply lined contours of his jaw. When he spoke, his voice was not the weak, fragmented whisper the defense had led the court to expect. It was a low, resonant, gravelly growl, a sound that carried the rough, heavy cadence of a man who had spent 40 years working in the deep underground pipes of the city, cutting through the room's microphone system with a terrifyingly clear authority. "The truth," Kovac whispered, a faint, condescending smile playing at the corners of his lips, "is that the prosecution is trying to measure a sovereign empire using the language of a minor zoning violation. They sit there with their digital maps, their 3D electron microscopes, and their zinc gold dust, trying to reconstruct a moment they could never comprehend." I was on Low Avenue that night. I walked through the snow and I used that key. But I didn't go there to destroy Sarah Jenkins. I went there to fix a critical malfunction in the structural order of my block. A wave of low, horrified murmurs swept through the gallery, but the judge didn't strike his gavel. He sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the defendant with an intense, analytical revulsion. Thorne tried desperately to redirect his client, his face rapidly draining of color as he realized that Kovac was completely abandoning the narrative of neurological delusion. "Mr. Kovac, please clarify what you mean by that. Are you stating that you did not commit an act of violence against Miss Jenkins?" Kovac let out a short, wheezing chuckle that transformed into a dry, hollow cough before he cleared his throat, his black eyes flashing with a sudden, aristocratic fury. "Violence is the erratic tool of an amateur, Marcus. What I executed was an act of absolute territorial administration," Kovac declared, his voice rising, vibrating with an unhinged, systemic conviction that froze the blood of every juror in the box. Bridgeport in 2004 was a neighborhood built on foundations of concrete, tradition, and absolute silence. It was a kingdom that required strict maintenance. Sarah Jenkins was a beautiful girl, but she was an anomaly on South Low Avenue. She wanted to shatter the isolation of the block. She wanted to bring the chaotic outside world into her classroom. She wanted to tear open windows that had been set in stone for generations. She was a leak in the system. I took her keys because they were my keys. I studied her house because it was my grid. I used those zip ties to ensure absolute, static stabilization while I excised the contamination from my territory. I spent 22 years watching the police cars circle her house from my front porch, and I never felt a single second of fear because I knew that time, history, and the concrete of that street belonged to me. I had the balls to maintain the line. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic storm of emotion. In the front row, Sarah's surviving brother stood up, his face contorted with a blind, devastating rage, his voice cracking as he screamed raw curses at the smiling monster in the wheelchair before being immediately restrained by 3 court deputies and escorted out into the high-security corridor. The families of the other missing women whose bracelets were found in the safe clung to one another, their faces pale with an absolute, unvarnished horror. The neighbor they had spent 22 years ignoring wasn't denying his atrocities. He was framing them as civic duty, treating a multi-decade campaign of hidden dominance as his personal, architectural legacy. Marcus Thorne sank back into his chair at the defense table, his hands covering his face in a gesture of total, sweeping defeat, realizing that any hope of a legal defense had just been permanently vaporized by his own client's monstrous, uncontrollable vanity. District Attorney Carolyn Vance did not wait for the room to settle, rising from the prosecution table like a predatory hawk, her boots making a sharp, thunderous snapping sound against the floorboards as she walked directly into the well of the court. She stood just 2 feet from Kovac, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with an unyielding moral clarity that matched the intensity of his malice. She didn't carry a binder of files or a display of charts. She stood before him armed only with the absolute weight of historical justice. "So, Mr. Kovac," Vance began, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sliced through the residual murmurs of the room like a razor blade. "You call yourself a gatekeeper. You call yourself an engineer who maintains the structural order of a neighborhood. Let us look at the clinical, disgusting reality of your administration. When you entered that bungalow on South Low Avenue, wearing your heavy maintenance gloves and carrying your duplicated master key, you didn't perform a civic function. You cut her external power lines to throw her into absolute terror. You crept into her bedroom in the dark, and you used industrial zip ties to paralyze her. You applied specific, mechanical pressure to her carotid sinus, watching her fight for her breath, watching her heels kick fruitlessly against the sofa until her heart permanently stopped beating. Tell me, gatekeeper, did you see the absolute order in her terror? Did you evaluate the stabilization of the block as her body went cold under your hands? Kovac's smirk didn't vanish. It widened, his yellowed teeth glistening under the white LED lights of the courtroom, his breathing monitor providing a rhythmic, metallic hum as he leaned forward over the wooden rail of the witness box, his face just inches from the prosecutor's. I saw the exact second the system stabilized, Ms. Vance, he whispered, his voice a guttural, venomous rattle that was picked up perfectly by the microphone, echoing through the courtroom speakers like a curse from the past. It is a calculation that no schoolteacher can ever comprehend, the precise point where a disruption is permanently zeroed out. I didn't hate her. I managed her. And when I locked her classroom flashcards and her silver tokens inside my coal chute safe, I wasn't collecting trophies to hide from your police department. I was filing away the logs of a completed contract. I spent 22 years shoveling the snow from the porches of the people who sat in that living room crying for her, and they thanked me for it because I wore the uniform of a civic servant. Go ahead and cage this old bone, Ms. Vance. Lock this medical chair inside your concrete facility. It doesn't matter. The keys are still in my vault. The block remained silent for 2 decades because of my hands, and I have ruled that street with absolute, untouchable perfection while you were still learning how to write an indictment. The confession hung in the air like a lethal gas, an admission of such pure, unadulterated sociopathy that it struck the jury box like a physical blow. Vance did not offer a dramatic retort or a triumphant display of emotion. She stood perfectly still in the center of the well, letting the horrific echo of Kovac's words sink deep into the minds of the 12 citizens who held his fate in their hands. She simply turned her back on the smiling monster in the medical chair, walking back to the prosecution table with a slow, deliberate pace that signaled the definitive, final conclusion of the state's interrogation. The Phantom of Bridgeport had finally been stripped of his camouflage, exposed to the light of day not by a failure of his intellect, but by the ultimate, self-destructive weight of his own calculated arrogance. The trial was effectively over. The truth had been written in the record in letters of blood and fire, and the city of Chicago was about to witness the final, sweeping stroke of justice for a ghost that had waited 22 years in the dark. The thunderous echo of Michael Kovac's horrific courtroom confession hung over the chamber like a toxic fog, paralyzing the legal machinery of the Cook County Criminal Courthouse for several agonizing seconds. The 12 jurors sat completely motionless, their expressions locked in a collective state of profound, bone-chilling shock. Some stared at their hands, unable to process the unvarnished malice that had just vibrated through the courtroom speakers, while others kept their eyes pinned to the floor, actively avoiding the piercing, celebratory gaze of the emaciated monster in the specialized medical wheelchair. Marcus Thorne remained slumped at the defense table, his legal pad pushed aside, his fingers dug deep into his temples. He didn't look at his co-counsel. He didn't look at the bench. He knew with absolute, professional finality that his long career as an elite criminal defender had just hit an unyielding iron wall built by the uncontrollable, monstrous vanity of his own client. The judge was the first to reclaim the room, his gavel striking the wooden block 3 times with an immense, cannon-like report that shattered the silence and made the front rows of the gallery jump. The witness will step down, the judge ordered, his voice vibrating with an intense, unvarnished disgust that he didn't even attempt to mask. Mr. Thorne, does the defense have any further witnesses to present to this court? Thorne stood up with a heavy, dragging motion, his shoulders hunched as if he were suddenly carrying the weight of every cold case currently tied to the water management utility logs in the Chicago area. He kept his eyes averted from the defendant, whose heart and vital monitors continued to hum along with a serene, terrifyingly steady electronic rhythm. "No, Your Honor," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the historical strain. The defense rests. The court was immediately adjourned for a 24-hour recess to allow both sides to finalize their closing arguments, and the moment the massive mahogany exit doors swung open, the media plaza outside erupted into absolute, unbridled chaos. The news of Kovac's explicit, administrative justification of the Valentine's Day nightmare swept through the Midwest like a digital wildfire, saturating live streams, interrupting national broadcasts, and drawing thousands of citizens to the rain-slicked steps of the courthouse on 26th and California. The historical mystery that had haunted the Bridgeport neighborhood for 22 years was no longer an abstract cold case or a debate over forensic transfer protocols. It was a live-streamed excavation of a territorial predator's soul. Under the flashing streetlights of downtown Chicago, spontaneous crowds gathered, holding printouts of Sarah Jenkins' vibrant, smiling classroom photographs, their faces illuminated by the blue glare of smartphones broadcasting the graphic details of the gatekeeper's self-destruction. Inside the prosecution's high-security war room, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of celebration, remaining heavy with a somber, focused intensity. District Attorney Carolyn Vance sat at the head of a conference table buried beneath towering columns of archival evidence containers. She knew that while Kovac's witness stand outburst was a fatal blow to his legal survival, her closing argument needed to be a definitive, flawless summation that would leave the jury with absolutely no avenue for cognitive escape. She needed to weave together the scientific absolute of the 2026 wet vacuum DNA extraction, the historical geography of the South Low Avenue shared gangway, and the chilling psychological architecture that the defendant had so arrogantly validated. She worked through the night, the steady patter of the midnight Chicago rain beating against her office window, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she crafted a narrative designed to serve as the final, sweeping stroke of historical justice for Sarah Jenkins and every other woman whose safety had been systematically compromised in the dark. The following morning, the atmosphere inside courtroom 503 was a pressure cooker of historic anticipation. The gallery was packed so tightly that court marshals were forced to establish a rigid human wall along the central aisle, preventing the emotional overflow from spilling into the well of the court. The families of multiple missing women whose silver charm bracelets had been recovered from the hidden coal chute safe sat in the front 3 rows, their hands interlocked in a tight, protective chain of shared survival and impending vindication. When Kovac was wheeled into the room by 3 heavily armed deputies, his heart monitor rolling beside him, a cold, suffocating silence greeted him, a collective, societal shunning that stripped him of the theatrical attention his narcissism so desperately craved. He sat down at the defense table, his expression once again smooth, clean, and detached, as if he had spent his hours in the medical wing convincing himself that his monstrous admission was an act of supreme institutional dominance rather than a catastrophic legal suicide. Carolyn Vance rose from her chair, adjusted the lapel of her dark wool blazer, and walked toward the jury box for her final address to the 12 citizens of Cook County. She carried no notes, no digital tablets, and no physical exhibits. She stood before the box, her posture rigid, her voice carrying a resonant, unyielding moral clarity that commanded absolute focus from the very first syllable. "Gentlemen and ladies of the jury," Vance began, her words deliberate, pacing the length of the rail. 22 years ago, on a frozen night exactly like the ones we endure every winter, a brilliant young woman named Sarah Jenkins sat in a bungalow on South Low Avenue. She believed in the unique power of education. She believed that by teaching the children of Bridgeport, she could help build a vibrant, open future for this historic community. She trusted the neighborhood she lived in. She locked her front door against the known dangers of the world, never imagining that the phantom who would steal her life was watching her from the darkness of the adjacent window, a man who wore the uniform of a civic servant but carried the heart of an absolute predator. She stopped, making direct, intense eye contact with each juror in sequence. For more than 2 decades, Michael Kovac lived a life of absolute, untouchable respectability. He cleared the snow from your porches, He maintained the municipal water systems, and he presented himself as the patriarch of Low Avenue. He thought he had executed the perfect crime. He thought that by cutting the power lines, by copying the school district keys, and by using his specialized knowledge of the neighborhood's utility grids to kill without leaving a trace of forced entry, he had permanently blinded the eyes of justice. He believed that the passage of the years was his ultimate shield, that every winter snow that buried Chicago washed away a layer of his identity until his sins were nothing more than a neighborhood ghost story. But he made one fatal calculation. He forgot that the truth is not an abstract shadow. It is a physical, indelible signature written into the very machinery of the restraints he used. Vance turned her entire body, pointing a dramatic, rigid hand directly at the withered figure in the medical wheelchair, her voice rising into a powerful, dawn-dap crescendo that shook the high limestone ceilings of the historic room. Science caught up with him. The relentless march of human progress, the very progress he mocked from the witness stand, became his executioner. In 2026, the wet vacuum extraction systems of modern forensics read the dense clusters of skin tissue he left behind deep within the internal mechanical tracks of those zip ties, a genetic signature locked in an airtight plastic vault for 22 years, as unique and undeniable as a star in an empty sky. And if that scientific absolute were not enough, you heard the final truth from his own mouth. You saw the mask slide away. You saw the raw, unhinged arrogance of a monster who justified the strangulation of a 26-year-old teacher because he wanted to stabilize his territory. Do not allow his medical frailty to serve as his protection. Validate the science that trapped him. Honor the legacy of Detective Raymond Miller, whose logbooks predicted his identity, and let the ghost of Sarah Jenkins finally walk out of the dark gangway and into the permanent light of justice. When Vance returned to the prosecution table, a collective, heavy sigh swept through the entire gallery, a profound release of 22 years of pent-up sorrow that left several of the neighborhood residents openly weeping into their hands. Marcus Thorne then approached the podium for his closing remarks, his head slightly lowered, his voice completely stripped of the theatrical fire that had defined his long career as a defender of high-profile clients. He knew he was playing a permanently broken hand, trying to salvage a defense that his own client had gleefully set on fire on the witness stand. He didn't attempt to recontextualize Kovac's horrific descriptions of territorial administration or justify his chilling words. Instead, he launched into a highly technical, dry plea centered entirely on the concepts of legal insanity, cognitive dissolution, and the strict boundaries of reasonable doubt regarding ancient property lines and environmental DNA transfer. It was a highly competent, professional performance, but it rang entirely hollow in a room that was still vibrating with the echo of a territorial predator's literal self-glorification. The judge delivered his final, clinical instructions to the jury with a cold, precise execution, detailing the legal definitions of first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and the intentional destruction of municipal security infrastructure. At 2:15 p.m., the 12 jurors stood up, filed out of the courtroom in absolute silence, and entered the secure deliberation chamber, the heavy iron bolt clicking into place behind them with a sharp, historic finality. The clock on the mahogany wall began its slow, torturous countdown, marking the beginning of a wait that many veteran court reporters expected to last for days, given the immense volume of utility logs, blueprints, and microscopic metallurgical testing introduced during the trial. Outside on the rain-slicked plaza of 26th and California, the scene transformed into an absolute digital circus, with news anchors scrambling to their live-shot positions beneath the gray, drizzling sky, speculating on whether the defense team would immediately file an emergency appeal based on the cognitive capacity of the defendant. The local television networks brought on historical panels of legal scholars and forensic pathobiologists who analyzed every frame of Kovac's witness stand monologue, predicting that his unhinged words would become a defining case study in the dark psychology of territorial predation and the ultimate, self-destructive failure of malignant narcissism. Inside the long, stone corridors of the courthouse, the air remained thick with an electric suspense, a community hanging in total balance as 22 years of unresolved Bridgeport trauma waited for a final, sweeping resolution. The iron-reinforced doors of the Cook County Deliberation Room remained sealed for exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes, an astonishingly brief window of time for a trial that had resurrected 22 years of historical Chicago trauma, yet an agonizing eternity for the assembly of families, journalists, and legal teams anchored to the stone benches of Courtroom 503. The steady, mechanical ticking of the brass wall clock seemed to double in volume with every passing minute, a rhythmic countdown toward the final, definitive resolution of the Valentine's Day nightmare. Inside the main gallery, the air was hot, stagnant, and heavily charged with the nervous energy of whispering reporters testing their wireless audio transmitters. When 3 sharp, metallic raps echoed from the inside of the heavy oak door, signaling that the 12 citizens of Chicago had reached a unanimous consensus, a collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a frantic, chaotic scramble for seats as court marshals flooded the well of the court. Michael Kovac was wheeled back into the room by a phalanx of 4 heavily armed deputies, his frail, emaciated wrists bound in transport chains that clanked against the metal frame of his medical wheelchair with a sharp, industrial finality. His physical appearance had undergone a subtle but terrifying transformation during the brief waiting period. The calculated, serene detachment that had served as his neighborhood camouflage for over 2 decades seemed to have hardened into a frozen, unyielding mask of absolute, aristocratic defiance. He did not skin the gallery for his remaining municipal associates, nor did he look toward his defeated defense team. He kept his chin tilted upward, his black, piercing eyes locked onto the empty jury box with the predatory intensity of a gatekeeper waiting for a clock to strike midnight. He sat perfectly straight, the soft, mechanical hum of his vital monitors providing a grotesque, rhythmic soundtrack to the room's suffocating silence. District Attorney Carolyn Vance rose slowly from the prosecution table, her face an unreadable mask of absolute professional focus, though the slight, rigid tightening of her jaw revealed the profound personal weight the historic case had extracted from her team. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes tracking the 12 jurors as they filed back into the room in a slow, silent line. The jurors did not look at the defense table. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor or the judge's bench, a traditional, universal tell that sent a wave of chilling certainty through the front rows of the gallery where Sarah Jenkins' surviving brother sat with his knuckles turned a ghostly white. Marcus Thorne leaned over to whisper a final, administrative note into Kovac's ear, but the convicted predator merely offered a faint, dismissive nod, completely rejecting the reality of his imminent legal execution. The judge cleared his throat, the sound slicing through the silence like a tactical knife. Gentlemen and ladies of the jury, have you arrived at a verdict? The foreperson, a soft-spoken high school physics teacher who had spent 3 weeks absorbing the clinical mechanics of wet vacuum DNA extraction and historical municipal utility geography, stood up, his hands holding a single sheet of state-issued paper that trembled slightly in his grip. "We have, Your Honor," he replied, his voice carrying a resonant, solemn weight that filled every corner of the high-ceilinged room. "On the count of aggravated kidnapping, how do you find?" The foreperson took a deep breath, looking directly at the judge. "We find the defendant, Michael Kovac, guilty." A sharp, collective intake of breath echoed from the press section, but before the sound could fully materialize, the judge pressed forward. "On the count of first-degree murder, how do you find?" The foreperson paused, his eyes shifting for the first time toward the defense table, locking directly onto the weathered, unblinking face of the 71-year-old retired city worker. "We find the defendant, Michael Kovac, guilty as charged." The courtroom erupted into a controlled, devastating storm of human emotion. In the front row, Sarah's brother dropped his head onto the wooden rail, his shoulders shaking violently as 22 years of unresolved sorrow, guilt, and agonizing silence finally collapsed into a torrent of tears. The families of multiple missing women whose silver charm bracelets were found in the coal chute safe clung to one another in a tight, protective huddle, their faces washed with a mixture of profound, shattering grief and immense, historical vindication. Their daughters' cases had not been officially adjudicated in this specific trial, But the legal destruction of the monster, who kept their stolen tokens locked in a subterranean vault, felt like the first true step toward reclaiming their names. From the dark archives of the forgotten, flashbulbs from the media pool began firing in a rapid, blinding sequence, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone walls as reporters filed their breaking digital alerts. Through it all, Michael Kovac did not move a single muscle. He sat perfectly still in his medical wheelchair, his black eyes still anchored on the jury box, his expression a terrifying void of complete psychological emptiness. He did not flinch, he did not rage, and he did not show a single hint of remorse. Instead, a slow, asymmetric curl appeared at the corner of his lips, a faint, condescending smirk that signaled his absolute, unyielding contempt for the system that had just condemned his flesh. To a malignant narcissist of his caliber, a guilty verdict was not a moral judgment or a declaration of his criminality. It was simply a bureaucratic error committed by a panel of inferiors who lacked the vision to understand his preservation of the block. The judge slammed his gavel down with an immense, thunderous report that brought an immediate, uneasy quiet back to the room. He turned his gaze toward the defense table, his eyes burning with an intense, unvarnished disgust that had been building throughout the trial. Michael Kovac, the judge stated, his voice vibrating with a powerful, authoritative resonance. You have spent the last 2 decades living an existence of unparalleled cowardice and depravity. You wrapped yourself in the blue-collar uniform of a civic servant, utilizing the quiet anonymity of our city's historic utility networks to camouflage a soul of absolute, unvarnished darkness. You treated independent, brilliant young women not as human beings with futures, but as raw materials for your own monstrous, perverted territorial fetishism, and when Sarah Jenkins dared to look at the world with an open vision you envied, you strangled her in the dark. The judge leaned forward over his bench, pointing his index finger directly at the convicted killer. You stood on that witness stand and told this court that you have maintained the structural order of your block by cutting her life out of the neighborhood. Well, Mr. Kovac, today the world cuts you out of its territory. You will spend every remaining hour of your natural life inside a maximum security concrete cell, stripped of your neighborhood porch, stripped of your tools, and stripped of the uniform you used as your shield. You will be remembered not as a gatekeeper, not as an engineer, but as a clinical, pathetic anomaly, a predator who was outsmarted by the very restraints he pulled in the dark. For the crime of first-degree murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the remote possibility of parole. Take him away. As the deputies stepped forward to unlock his transport chains and guide his medical wheelchair toward the holding cell door, Kovac slowly tilted his head back, looking directly at Detective Sarah Lindquist, who stood near the prosecution table. He didn't speak aloud, but his lips parted into that slow, yellow-toothed smile, his eyes flashing with a chilling, ancient malice that seemed to communicate a final, terrifying promise. The concrete cannot empty the vault, Detective. The keys are still mine in the dark. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him with a sharp, definitive report, marking the permanent, final end of his 22-year campaign of untouchable Bridgeport terror. Outside on the rain-slicked plaza of 26th and California, the scene was an absolute carnival of digital journalism and public catharsis. The news of the guilty verdict had transformed the gray, drizzling Chicago afternoon into a sea of flashing emergency lights, sweeping banners, and cheering crowds. District Attorney Carolyn Vance and Detective Sarah Lindquist stepped out onto the wide steps, immediately swarmed by a dense forest of microphones, television cameras, and shouting reporters from global news desks. Vance stood before the microphones, her face pale but resolute under the glaring studio lights, her voice steady as she addressed a city that had been haunted by the phantom of South Low Avenue since the winter of 2004. Today, Vance declared, her words carrying clearly across the crowded plaza, the city of Chicago has proven that the winter snow does not bury the signature of murder. 22 years ago, Michael Kovac believed that his complete lack of a modern criminal footprint, his municipal position, and his meticulous forensic cleaning placed him entirely beyond the reach of the law. He believed that by cutting the power lines, duplicating the keys, and waiting for the decades to pass, he could turn the execution of Sarah Jenkins into a permanent, insoluble riddle. But he underestimated the power of science, and more importantly, he underestimated the unyielding determination of a community that refuses to let its daughters be forgotten. This verdict does not bring Sarah back, nor does it instantly heal the deep, jagged wounds carried by the families of the other missing women whose silver charm bracelets we are still actively tracking through the federal clearinghouses. But it sends an absolute, unshakable message to every predator hiding in the civic shadows of our neighborhoods. No matter how long you wait, no matter how deep you bury your secrets, modern science will find you, the law will catch you, and historical justice will have its sweeping day. The crowd erupted into a long, deafening roar of applause, a powerful sound that echoed through the historic brick alleys of Bridgeport and across the cold, gray waters of the Chicago River. The digital tickers on the massive television trucks flashed the definitive, sweeping update to the story that had gripped the nation. Chicago 2004 cold case solved. Neighborhood gatekeeper convicted of first-degree murder. The active investigation had concluded. The trial had reached its violent psychological climax, and the legal system had delivered a crushing blow to one of the most sophisticated territorial predators in the history of the Midwest. Yet, as the crowds began to disperse into the falling municipal dusk, a deep, unsettling silence began to settle over the lower utility grids where Kovac had spent his life. A cold realization that the thousands of miles of underground pipes and historic city schematics he had navigated for 40 years would require a much deeper, more painful excavation before the true, terrifying scope of his secret empire could ever be fully dragged into the light.